Before Spider-Man came into the MCU, and before Insomniac took over the Spider-Man game franchise, Activision and the developer of Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, Beenox, built two open-world Spider-Man games centered around the pair of Amazing Spider-Man films from director Marc Webb. Find out about both of them in Amazing Spider-Man Game Duology. Game Facts Special. The start of a new era. When Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 got its plug pulled in January 2010, work immediately began on a reboot of the Spider-Man film franchise. After a year of development, a new film in a new universe was announced in February 2011, and the video game accompaniment was announced at the 2011 New York Comic-Con in October, just 8 months later. Unfortunately, that announcement wasn't backed up with any kind of gameplay footage or even images of the game in action. It was more like a statement of intent, but there were a few particularly interesting pieces of information included in that announcement. Game developer Beenox would be building the game from the ground up that would also take place after the events of the film. The fact that the Amazing Spider-Man video game would itself act as a kind of sequel to the movie it tied into seemed adventurous even at the time. But having Beenox as the developer was something that was a mixed bag in terms of sentiment. You see, after the average reviews of Shaba Games' Spider-Man Web of Shadows, Beenox took over development duties on Spider-Man games for Activision. Beenox and Activision had collaborated previously on ports of Ultimate Spider-Man and Spider-Man Friend or Foe, but now they were being given a budget to create their own Spider-Man game, and boy was it a doozy. The first Spider-Man game was a game so good and so inspired that it is directly responsible for a comic run that was used as a basis for probably the best Spider-Man movie ever made, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. That's right, the multiversal adventures of 2014's Spider-Verse comics and 2018's Into the Spider-Verse and its upcoming sequel can be traced back to Beenox's work on Shattered Dimensions. Unfortunately, they also made Spider-Man Edge of Time, which was not nearly as beloved or well-reviewed. Activision wanted another game immediately after Shattered Dimensions, which meant Edge of Time had a short development timeline, and we all know what happens when things are rushed. To make matters worse, Edge of Time was released around the same time the Amazing Spider-Man video game was announced. So, Spider-Man fans weren't sure what to think about Beenox working on a potentially huge Spider-Man project. Thankfully, the Canadian development studio was more than open to feedback. Developing the Amazing Spider-Man. Doug Heder, a producer at Activision in charge of Beenox's Spider-Man games, openly recognized Beenox's mixed track record. However, he promised that the upcoming film tie-in would not suffer the same fate as Edge of Time due to its increased development time. According to Beenox's creative director, Gerard Lahayani, they took the Amazing Spider-Man project very seriously. When Beenox was assigned to start working on The Amazing Spider-Man, they split their workforce into two teams, one that was finishing up Edge of Time and one that would start building The Amazing Spider-Man. So, when the game was announced, but not shown, it had allegedly been in development for about a year already, which meant they had another 8 months until it would launch. That was more development time than they had for their previous two games, and meant that they had plenty of time to plan out what they wanted to do, and implement the feedback they were getting from Edge of Time reviews. It would seem they used their time wisely, because the Amazing Spider-Man game was not just incredibly different from their previous projects, but it also took a lot of interesting creative risks. Unlike Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time, The Amazing Spider-Man returned to the open-world free-roam map of Manhattan that the previous Spider-Man film tie-ins made standard. In more than one interview, Beenox studio head Dee Brown stated that he wanted to give Spider-Man the game he deserves. And it seems like he tried his best, because Beenox threw everything and the kitchen sink into this game. Since the film their game was on was going to be a complete reboot, that gave the Beenox team the inspiration they needed to make something special. The Amazing Spider-Man has stealth gameplay and rhythmic combat, heavily inspired by Rocksteady's Batman Arkham games, complete with a dedicated dodge button and flashy finishing moves. Of course, players were also encouraged to use the new web shooters, which could be upgraded with experience points. One interesting graphical touch the team included was that as Spider-Man suffered damage in battle, his suit would tear and deteriorate just as it does in the movie. To get around the open world, Beenox worked hard on what they called Web Rush. This system allowed players to pick a point in the distance, press a button, and Spider-Man would automatically travel to that point as quickly and stylishly as possible, with different animations being used depending on what needed to be traversed to get to that point. Running on walls, swinging on flagpoles, and web zipping made for a traversal system that was as cool looking as it was efficient. This was allegedly one of the most difficult parts of the game to get working, since Beenox knew it needed to work just as well within the indoor missions as it did in the overworld, which required very different calculations and animations. Instead of the standard third-person camera, this Spider-Man game used a much closer, over-the-shoulder perspective similar to Resident Evil 4. This greatly increased the sense of immersion and the illusion of speed in the game, and remains as something that makes The Amazing Spider-Man unique, even among more recent Spider-Man games. Beenox also convinced Marvel to allow them to include full issues of comics within the game as unlockables, including the very first appearance of Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Additionally, their decision to place the game's story after the events of the movie allowed them to create a story that wasn't bound by the movie's script. This resulted in the inclusion of reinvented villains like Rhino, who instead of being just a dude in a suit, was now a half-rhino, half-human hybrid out for revenge on his creators. Very, very cool. On top of all that, the overworld would evolve and offer different random crime missions as you progress through the story. They brought back Bruce Campbell to cameo and homage to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie games, and, maybe most importantly, you could play as Stan Lee in a mission that saw him reclaiming lost pages of a comic he was working on. But instead of walking around, he has the same web-swinging and wall-crawling powers as Spider-Man. As you can see, the Amazing Spider-Man game had quite a lot going for it. Unfortunately, the game was met with the same average reviews as Edge of Time, with only the PS3 version breaking past a 70 Metacritic score after it was launched, alongside versions for the Nintendo Wii, 3DS, DS, and Xbox 360 on June 26, 2012. Not quite the reception Beenox was hoping for, especially considering all the effort they put into it. But they would get a second chance shortly after The Amazing Spider-Man launched. Second Chances, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Following in the footsteps of its predecessor, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was announced at the 2013 New York Comic-Con, and given a release date for spring of the following year. In addition to targeting the same consoles as the last go-round, it would also launch on the brand new PS4 and the Xbox One a little later on. With the promise of new hardware to fuel their creative flow, Beenox dove back into the world of The Amazing Spider-Man again, for the last time. Beenox was made aware of the issues with The Amazing Spider-Man, and took everything into account when making the sequel. They rebuilt the open world from the ground up, utilizing more interesting architecture and creating more diverse neighborhoods in order to, according to executive producer Stefan Gravel, create a more fun and interesting playground to web-swing around. Although the inclusion of the subway fast travel system meant that you didn't have to swing around if you didn't want to. Speaking of web swinging, that system was also completely overhauled. Instead of using a single trigger to throw web lines to invisible anchor points, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 made use of both triggers for swinging. Each trigger corresponds to an arm, and proper web swinging involved practiced timing of trigger pulls and jumps to gain speed and maneuver. This change made getting around more immersive and interactive. Web Rush mode, a fan favorite from The Amazing Spider-Man, also made its return. Its use in combat was also expanded, allowing for precision dodges and critical strikes. The Hero or Menace morality system was a new inclusion Beenox developed for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but was one that was unfortunately not very well received. In order to maintain hero status, players would have to respond to the infinite, repetitive random crimes that occurred throughout the city, another returning feature from the previous game. If they failed to respond in time or completely ignored too many of those side activities, their reputation would decrease into menace status, and strike teams would spawn in around the city to attack Spider-Man. This system was so poorly received that Beenox's co-head Thomas Wilson actually apologized for it years later in an interview with Games Radar. Hanging up the suit. For all of the improvements and new mechanics that were attempted for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, the game was ultimately seen as a step down from the previous title. It was critically panned, with none of the many versions of the game scoring higher than a 58 Metacritic score. Critics cited a lack of polish, dull combat, and overall poor execution in just about every review. Just like Edge of Time, it would seem The Amazing Spider-Man 2's shortened development time caused its demise. Despite their passion for the license, Beenox just wasn't able to put together the stellar Spider-Man game they wanted to make. And unfortunately, they never got another chance. The third Amazing Spider-Man film never materialized. Beenox moved on to working on Skylanders and Call of Duty games, and Insomniac developed the next Spider-Man game for Sony, which we will talk about real soon. Thanks to Mike Alexander for writing this episode. Check out our episodes on every canceled X-Men, Spider-Man, Marvel, and Batman games. This is McJen signing off. Thanks for watching. This has been a Game Facts Special.